Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining this afternoon's webinar, at least in my time zone. Today, we're going to be looking at one of my favorite subjects to talk about on Capture One, which is local adjustments. So we've got pretty much a whole hour to spend looking at that subject and getting you well and truly started with enjoying this feature in Capture One. In case this is your first webinar, you're listening to myself, David. I'm part of the software marketing team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. And as I just mentioned, we'll have around 45 to 60 minutes with each other on our subject. You're very welcome and encouraged to pose questions throughout. If you're on your Mac or PC, if you look at the bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see a section called questions. In there, you can type a question and that will come straight through to me. On your iPhone, iPad, Android device, you'll see a question mark icon, and you can tap that and again type in a question and it will come through to me. I am recording the webinar, so don't feel you have to remember everything or take notes, etc. You can watch it again at your leisure. Details of where that recording will be is going to be at the end of the webinar and also in the follow-up email that you're going to get. So let's move on and get started and go through how we do wonderful local adjustments in Capture One. Let me just rearrange some screens. So you should be seeing Capture One up on screen in a second. Hopefully you should be seeing that now. To help you see the mouse, we have this, which is just crosshairs around the pointer just to give you a better indication of where I am. I've noticed in recent weeks that GoToWebinar, they seem to have dropped the frame rate a little bit on the transmission. I don't know if that's for quality or for something else, but I'll try to be as slow and careful as possible when talking about local adjustments. So I'm in Capture One Pro 8, of course, and the first thing to mention is that local adjustments compared to version 7 has had some improvements, certainly on performance, but probably most noticeably is the tools down here on the left-hand side in the local adjustments tool tab. That's the one that looks like a paintbrush, have been extended. So we have more tools now that we can use with local adjustments. If you don't see all of these, I won't list them. You can read or figure it out yourself. If you go to Window, Workspace, Default, then that will load up the default workspace, which will include all the compatible tools for local adjustments. The basic premises, of course, of a local adjustment is that you can choose some area that you want to locally adjust on an image and then apply any or all of these adjustments to that particular area. It's very useful for, of course, balancing exposure, color edits, all kinds of things. So we're going to go through a few images and basically show you how it works. So starting at the very basics, in your local adjustments tool, this is very much like your layers palette if you're used to using Photoshop. Obviously not as powerful as Photoshop, but equally powerful in its own right. So this is where you'll see assembled layers appeared down here, and that's up to 10 different layers you can have. You've got 4 buttons down here. The first one is brush settings. We can actually bring that up on the image itself, and I'll show you how to do that. But that's 3 parameters, basically size, hardness, and opacity. Pen pressure and auto mask we'll come back to. Then in the next space along, you'll see the brush icon. This allows you to switch between the draw mask, the erase mask, the gradient mask, which we'll look at, and some various options for showing and displaying the mask. I'm pretty much going to turn the mask on and off to show you how it's working. In normal operation, you'll probably prefer this one, which only displays the mask as you're drawing. So it's automatically hiding when you stop drawing and showing when you do draw. But I'm going to turn the mask on and off using the M shortcut button so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, if we look at what the brush is doing, let's right click and just make that brush a bit bigger. Now you'll see the brush has 2 circles, inner circle and outer circle. The inner circle is where the brush is at full opacity, and the outer circle is where it's fading down to 0 or feathering down to 0. So if we do a right click and just set the hardness to 100 and I can draw a stroke, then you can see what that looks like. If I right click once more and set the hardness down to 0 and draw another stroke, let's just go over here, then you can see quite clearly the difference. If I right click once more, let's just up the hardness a bit and drop opacity. If I draw once more, then you'll see as I draw back and forth, as I'm on a low opacity, it's gradually building up the opacity with each stroke. So that's basically how you vary your brush style. Now, of course, if I turn the mask off, that's M on the keyboard. You'll see as I moderate exposure, for example, you can see obviously with no feathering, it's a hard edge. With some feathering, it's a soft edge. And with the opacity, it moderates the effect of that underlying adjustment. So these three things we can use to really control how our local adjustment is working. To delete that layer, we can just say minus, and equally to add a layer, we can say plus, like so, up to 10 layers, as I said before. Let's clear up Herb's question now, because I'm sure a few of you are going to ask it as well. OS 10 Yosemite, I would recommend not to upgrade just yet. If you're specifically wanting to know if Capture One is working nicely with Yosemite. For some people it is, others see certain glitches. So within the coming week, probably, maybe a bit longer, we'll launch Capture One 802, which we'll specify for Yosemite support. So just hang on to yourself before you upgrade to Yosemite. Matthias is asking, how come is there a lag when there's brushing? That's probably due to GoToWebinar, but it's perfectly fluid when I brush on the screen. So that's just a limitation of a webinar broadcast, I'm afraid. Once you've drawn the mask, a couple of you are asking, can you adjust the opacity? No, but you can vary the opacity, which you'll see by adding brush strokes or removing brush strokes, and you'll see how that works. Okay, so just to give you an example on this particular image, let's just go from the start very quickly. So first on this image, when you're ever doing local adjustments, it makes sense to obviously do all your other corrections first. So I'm just going to fix perspective on this one in particular, as I wasn't very straight. So that just helps to fix that. C on the keyboard for crop, let's just bring in my crop a little bit, like so. V on the keyboard to get back to the pointer, and now we can start doing some local adjustment. So as I said before, choose your brush, B on the keyboard if you want the shortcut, like so. I'm pretty happy with that, so M on the keyboard to see the brush. Let's just get my opacity up to 100%, and then I'm just going to brush in here. It's perfectly fluid for me, it's not lagging, so I think it's probably just, as I said, a limitation of the webinar broadcast as such. So a very rough mask like that. Once we've got our mask in place, we could then use any of the tools to moderate. So if I wanted to add some more clarity and structure, I could darken the background a little bit and then counteract that by brightening the top layer and so on. So that's just a real basic example of how you can improve an image with a local adjustment. Maybe I'll just finish with a slight vignette, and there we go. So even a simple thing like that with a local adjustment can help to improve on an image. You can't change the opacity with stylus pressure. Chris is asking, you can change the size of the brush with stylus pressure. I agree, it might be a nice feature to have the ability to use pen pressure for opacity or size or both. So that could be something that's a good feedback to the developers. Okay, so now we've got the basics down. Let's look at a few more features. There's a couple of additional options hiding up here. In the three dots you see at the top of the tool, we've got invert, fill, and copy, which are all three very useful features. Now on this particular image, what I want to do is just bring the background down a bit, just to emphasize our bearded dragon here a bit better. And we can also do something with sharpening on a a particular layer as well, because in this case, if we just zoom into 100%, it's not hugely noisy, but it's a little bit noisy in the background. Probably hard to tell on the webinar broadcast, but there's no point sharpening the background. I've got no detail there to sharpen. So what I'm going to do on the background layer is I'm actually going to drop sharpening down to 0, and we're going to treat sharpening purely on our model itself and also a few other adjustments. Before I do that, let's just look at our adjustments. Exposure wise, it's probably pretty good. I'll just fix the levels slightly, and the first thing I want to do is mask the dragon itself. So let's choose our brush tool, draw mask, pick a reasonable size brush. I'm going to make that a bit smaller, and I'm just going to roughly go around the edge. So again, not being too pernickety about it. I am using a Wacom tablet. We'll talk a bit more about that later, but I find it much easier to use a Wacom tablet than trying to do this with a mouse. I'd find this very difficult drawing with a mouse, to be honest. So let's just go around the edge. Now I could brush to fill in the center, but what's easier to do is back up here. We've got an option called fill mask, like so. And that would just fill in the center quite nicely. Any mistakes, I'll just add a little bit more in then. So now we've got a filled mask, and I can treat this guy completely independently. So sharpening wise, whoops, let's zoom in again. Option Command 0 to zoom in. So sharpening wise, we've got none on the background, but on our top layer, I can dial in a bit more sharpening. And a good adjustment that I want to use here is clarity. Clarity is great for bringing out fine details. Again, if you look at the iris, that's the right word. And if I just bring structure up a bit, then it really brings out that detail and in the skin as well. But I don't want to do that on the background because it's just going to get noisy. So this makes sense to do this on a separate layer. So he's looking much better now. Now, as I said, I wanted to do something with the background. So instead of having to mask the background, what I'll do is I'll make a new layer. And I'm just going to call this background, like so. And rather than doing a mask, what I'll do is I will say copy mask from layer 1, and then I can say invert mask. So what I've got now is a complete inverse. If I just press M on the keyboard to turn the mask on and off, like so, then I've got a complete inverse of that mask. So what I think I'll do is I'll drop the saturation down a bit. I think I might drop the exposure down slightly, and then I will drop just a bit of a vignette, and there we go. So that's a pretty easy way to treat a foreground subject separate from the background subject. I've got all the sharpening on our subject only. You could argue actually in the out of focus areas I could take the mask away for sharpening if I wanted to, but I don't think it's going to make that much difference. So I've got sharpening and structure on our foreground guy, no sharpening or structure on the background because I said that's going to get noisy. So that's looking much better than it did before. Let's just bring up actually a new variant. Let's say new variant. So this will be our before and after, like so. So you get a better idea of what structure's doing now. If you look around the eye, it just jumps out a bit more, and then we've got a nice clean background as well. What I could do actually on our, if we just select the one we've been adjusting, Command 0 to fit screen. On our background here, if you remember, this is just my selected background. We could actually pump up the noise reduction a bit as well if we wanted to. So we could bring up noise reduction even more, which will just help to get rid of any noisiness that I have in the background itself. So don't forget, noise reduction part of a layer 2. Can you delete previous brush strokes? Alan is asking. Yes, there's an erase brush, of course. So if, for example, let's just rename this to Dragon. So for example, if I made a mistake, let's say if we turn the mask on, if I went whoops accidentally up here, we can press E on the keyboard to get erase, or you can choose it here, erase mask, like so. So if I just wanted to take that away, then I could just brush away like so, and then get rid of the mask there itself. Whoops, except my opacity was down at 0 practically. So let's try that again. There we go. So yeah, you can erase and draw, no problem at all. Pat is asking, what is the clarity method in the local adjustment? I think I used, you see here, no, that's actually a good point to bring up. You see here, clarity is grayed out. So on the background layer, whatever clarity method you have set on the background layer has to be the same for all the layers on top. So it always has to be the same. So if I change the background layer to punch, for example, then on the next layers up, it would also have to be punch. You can't mix different clarities on different layers just to make that clear as such. So we could actually dial a bit in on that layer. To delete a variant, Peter is asking, just right click and say remove from album, and that will take it away like so. Okay, let's go to the next one. So we've looked at just basic brushing masks in, etc. So what about gradient masks? Gradient masks are very useful, not just for landscapes, which is what we're looking at here, but for all kinds of applications. But we use a landscape because that's the most common one. We grab the image which has no adjustments on it, like so. It's not very straight. Not one of my fortes is holding a camera straight. So something like that. Now, typically, of course, in this situation, if we just drop exposure down, we can see we've got loads more drama going on in the sky. But of course, the dynamic range is a bit too much for the camera to cope with as such. Now, we could, of course, use high dynamic range, which gets a bit more back. But if we want to kind of add, clarity into the sky as well, or extra contrast, then that's not going to help us enough. So what we could do in this case is use a gradient mask. So again, choose it here, gradient mask like so, or G on the keyboard, and you'll get a small cross, which is probably difficult for you to see, but there it is. And this allows you to draw the gradient. So where you start drawing, the mask will be at its strongest. Where you finish drawing, the mask will have faded to 0. You don't have to start at the top of an image. You could start anywhere you like. So if I started here, the mask would be at 100% from this point to this point. So just think about where you want to start and finish the mask. So I'll probably do something like that. If you hold your shift key down, it will keep it perfectly straight or at a 45-degree angle. I'll probably angle this in a little bit just so it's similar to the shape of the building. Press M on the keyboard. That's the mask that I've ended up with. And now, of course, what I can do is drop my exposure down. We could have a bit more contrast if we wanted. We could have some more clarity, for example. No point adding structure. What I could do again is bump up noise reduction because there's not really any sharp detail in the cloud, but it will clean up any noise. It was quite a dingy day. That's at ISO 800 again. Now, of course, what can happen with a gradient mask, unless you've got a perfect horizontal horizon, which very rarely happens, then of course your gradient mask might affect things that you don't want it to affect. But like any mask, you can take or you can edit the gradient mask. So all I can do now is if I choose my erase mask brush over here, or E on the keyboard, then I get my erase mask. I would recommend, if you do this, have a fairly big brush and drop the opacity down to something in the 10s or the low 20s. Then what we can do is simply erase. Repeated strokes will take more and more away from that gradient mask. If it's not having dramatic enough effect, up the opacity. If you go too high with the opacity, it looks really obvious what you've done. So this way gives a much more natural effect of how it's working. So I can just take a few steps here to brush away any gradient. And remember, repeated brushing removes that even more. So if I press M on the keyboard now, you can see that my mask is kind of following the shape better of the sky itself. If you want to preview the layer, don't forget, you can turn off the layer and turn on the layer, and then you can see the effect it's having, and it's easy to adjust back and forth. Rosemary is asking, will changes made to the background layer affect both the masked layers above as well. Yes, so for example, on layer 1, I've got a drop of exposure. So let's just drop that right down. If I go to my background and then bump up exposure, you see it does affect everything. So it's kind of a balancing act between your various different layers as such. So yes, background will affect all layers, and then the individual layers will affect that afterwards. So it's like an additive process, if you like. Yes, Jack, Control Z will erase a last brush stroke. So Control Z or undo option here will simply remove the last brush stroke if you make a mistake. Dita's asking, when you add clarity, is a setting of, for example, 20 on an adjustment layer the same as 20 on the background layer? Yes, but of course it can be additive. So let's say on the background I put loads of clarity, and then on this layer I put more clarity, then it keeps adding up and up and up and up. So if you want extreme clarity, you can just keep adding more and more layers if you wish. So yes, you can do that. Simon's asking, will making a variant copy the local adjustment layers? Yes, if you say new variant will copy the image with no adjustments whatsoever. Clone variant will copy the image with all adjustments, including local adjustments, so everything. Okay, yeah, as you see, I've just done it there, so I've got exactly the same image, like so, with the two different layers. The stacking order of the layers doesn't have any effect. No, that's a question from Heine. You can't drag layers into different orders or anything like that, so it has no effect whatsoever. Let's have a little look at dodging and burning. I saw a couple of people have asked about the tablet, and I'm going to talk about the tablet when we get to this image down here, I think. So yes, we will talk about the tablet, don't worry. And the auto masker as well. So I mentioned earlier a bit about dodging and burning, and we'll actually have a go with this image because it works really nicely, and also in black and white as well. Now this image was actually done in Capture One 7. And I can actually get away with far less layers now just because the HDR tool is working so much better. So I'll explain in a bit better detail as we go in, but I've got loads of layers there, but I can actually cut it down to much less. Yes, it's my shot, Pat, who is asking. So not out in the wild, sadly, at a zoo, but it's good enough. Okay, so we're going to crop to square, I think. So I've chosen 1 by 1 here in the crop tool. Good tip, if you hold the shift key down, you can override any existing crop and make a brand new crop. So that just saves a bit of time. V on the keyboard to get back to the pointer. Now, before we go black and white, before you do any black and white, you should, of course, start with a good color image. So it's probably slightly hot, so I'm just going to bring the exposure down. And maybe a little bit of highlight recovery, but that's good enough for a base. Maybe darken the midtones a bit. So if we go to black and white, I'm going to enable the black and white tool. Let's drop the greens down a bit and probably the yellows down a bit as well. Again, maybe drop exposure a bit more, and then we can begin to work on this guy a bit. Before I do anything else, though, let's just have some natural clarity. And definitely on this image, if we go to just 50 odd %, structure is great for fur. So if you've got anything furry in your images, structure does a really nice job of enhancing fur as well. So it's hard to see on the webinar transmission, I'm sure, but have a look at any images you have, like in the examples I've shown. Structure is really good for enhancing that, especially if you're going to print them out as well. So let's go back down to 0 and let's talk about dodging and burning. If you worked in the darkroom like I did too long ago to think about, then it was, of course, a nice luxury to have to be able to dodge and burn images, and you can do the same thing in Capture One quite nicely. So if I say draw mask, I'm going to make a new layer before doing anything else and call this burn. And again, before brushing, I'm going to drop the exposure down to something around the sort of -2 stops mark. Nothing happens, of course. And then I'm going to take my brush, make it nice and big. Probably a low opacity, under 10 maybe, in the high single digits. And what I can do now is that we can just brush away, and then just to basically give us, if it's not kind of doing enough for you as such, you can always up the opacity a bit, and then we can brush a bit more as such. And if we just turn that on and off, then that just darkens that fur down a little bit more. So we can just brush around and around and around. And remember, each brush stroke adds a bit more. And then again, if you want to kind of go darker still, we could drop the exposure down a bit more. If I wanted to darken up in the corner here, around in the corner, down here as well as such, then we could easily, whoops, that's Wacom getting too excited there. Down here, we could, basically as you would have done in the darkroom as such, like so. So if we just turn that layer off and then turn it back on, then you see we can just drop those spots down. Now, as I said, for let's have a bit more contrast actually on that layer. As I said, in terms of the adjustments to make on this image, like if I wanted to brighten up the eye a little bit, if I just make a new layer called eye, and we can do a really kind of rough mask. We just get it roughly right, full opacity. Press M on the keyboard so you can see the mask. So if I just do a rough mask like that, then what I can do is just open up the shadow slider a bit, like so, and that just brightens the eye up. And again, I didn't have to be super accurate with the mask. I can just say open up the shadows, and that lifts the shadows of the eye without affecting anything else. Let's just burn again. Let's just reset that for a second. Let's just do a bit more burning. Brush opacity down. Low opacity always works if you want to burn in nicely. And so on. Now, if you want to do the opposite, which is dodging as such, then we can make a new layer, and we could call that dodge or dodge. We can push the exposure up like so. Take a nice soft brush again with a low opacity. Let's probably go larger. And then if you want to brighten any areas, then you can just gradually sort of brush away as you wanted to. So it's a really nice way to work back and forth, basically bringing in those various different elements. Of course, every time you do it, it looks different. That was, say, Capture One 7 effort, much harsher than that one. I don't know which one I prefer, actually. Let's have put clarity back in and a bit of structure, and then maybe somewhere in the middle. Let's finish off by a little bit of a vignette. So dodging and burning, I think, works really, really nicely. Let's just make a new variant, clone that variant actually, and let's turn off all the local adjustments and bring them up side by side. So on the left is with local adjustments, dodging and burning. On the right is without anything. So basically that just allowed us to sort of calm down this area on the right hand side and around here, which was just a little bit harsh, and we could brighten that shoulder up there. So it's really nice to dodge and burn. I think it's great fun. And just remember, all you need to do is either drop the exposure down or pump the exposure up, but the key is to always have a nice low opacity, otherwise it becomes too obvious. You can't save a preset for local adjustments, purely I think because I don't know this for certain. It was a question that came up earlier, because you'll notice that you can't save a preset for local adjustments, whereas you could in the white balance, for example, but you can't in the local adjustments, because the mask, of course, between images is very unlikely going to be the same. You can copy a mask from image to image, but you can't save a preset. Now, I might go back and argue that I would quite like to have a preset called dodge and burn with +2 and -2, just to save me setting it up. So I think that's something that we could change. Again, this is just another example. I won't go, well, we could go through this one, actually. Why not? We've got plenty of time. So that's the original. This is one after messing around with. You can see the various different options up on left hand side there. So the question came up this morning about what if I want to have some parts of the image black and white and some in color. You could easily do that because you can vary the saturation on various local adjustments, so it's pretty simple to do. So for example, on this image, let's just say reset. That's how it is without any adjustment, so it's a bit muddy, so we could open it up a little bit, adjust our levels to suit. To get the sky looking nicer, that's easy to do over here. If you remember, we have our gradient mask. I'll probably start drawing somewhere in the center and then finish off roughly down here, and then we can drop our exposure down. We could have a bit more clarity, and then let's do a similar thing with the foreground, and I'll show you what you could do if you wanted to mess around with mono slash color and so on. We could do another gradient mask, but this time let's say plus. I call this foreground. I normally don't bother naming them, which is kind of bad, I guess, but normally I know what each layer I've done, but when you start to have a lot of layers, that's when it gets confusing. So in the foreground, let's do a similar kind of grad, and then we could drop our exposure a bit on that. And now you'll see on the foreground, if I wanted to desaturate that, I could do, if on the sky I wanted to drop the saturation, I'll have that super saturated, drop the saturation down there. You can see how the grads work, and we could improve our grad a little bit like so. So it's really easy to mess around with saturation in those particular ways. I think on the one I did before, I went for quite low saturation on each part, a little bit of a vignette, and then to add a bit of light, I guess, and I'll show you an example from an Australian photographer in a minute. If we do the same thing, if I say dodge, which will means we need a positive exposure, and we need our draw mask brush, and we need to remember to set our opacity nice and low. So now if I just want to, let's make that bigger, if I just want to lighten some areas to give the sort of false appearance of light or something, or let's say we wanted to lighten up this cloud, for example, we just wanted to make them stand out a bit more, then it's very easy to do that with dodging and burning, and it's not noticeable either. So lots of different ways that we could do that. As I said, I'd show you an example if I just whiz down here to this shot by Christian Fletcher, Australian photographer, great guy. Just to show you an example of someone else's work. Gradation on the sky, very simple. Add light, as he's named it. So he's just created some sort of fake pools of light just to liven up the landscape a bit. And down here at the front of the image is a tree, which is just bothering him in terms of opacity. So he's just brightness, sorry. So it's just dropped the brightness down of that a bit. So for that kind of modeling of light, and again, this is an easy one, light in the foreground, darken the sky. Simple as that. Very simple. Let's whiz back, and I'm going to show you a trick with HDR. Now, if you know in Capture One 7 Capture One 8 compared to Capture One 7, we've improved the HDR tool so it's much more useful. This particular image was quite difficult to adjust in version 7 because even if I moved the highlight slider across all the way to the right hand side, I would actually only get about that much recovery in version 7, and I can get this much recovery in version 8, and it still looks realistic. Now, if you really, really, really want to go nuts on your HDR recovery, if you need to, or if it's for creative effect, then here's a nice trick. So we've got the same image. I've got 100 again on the highlight recovery, but let's say you want even more highlight recovery. Let's make a new layer. I'll call that more HDR. And then before doing anything else, we're just going to say fill mask. And if I press M on the keyboard, you see that's given me a complete fill over the whole image. Now again, if I drag my highlight slider all the way to the right hand side, then I get a double dose of HDR. So if we look at on the left hand side, the one over here on the left is just, if you remember, 100 points on highlight recovery, and then the one on the right hand side is 100 points on highlight recovery on a background layer and also another layer. So you can really go crazy with HDR if you want to. There's nothing to stop me adding another layer, even more HDR, for example, doing the same thing, just say fill mask. Just to remind you, that would give you a mask over the whole image as such, like so, and then I could drag the highlight slider across again. So we've gone from having, if I just drag that back to 0, oops, drag that back to 0. So we've gone from that to having a little bit of a dose, to having more HDR, to having even more HDR. So don't forget you can do that with the HDR and also shadow recovery as well. Walter's asking, could we use the exposure slider? Yes, you could, but remember, highlight recovery, that's only going to affect the highlights, and the shadows is only going to affect the shadows. So you see we've got a really wacky HDR look going on there as such. Some people like that, I don't, but you can get that overly done HDR effect if you want to. So for example, if you remember our Lima guy, like on the eye, for example, if I just turn that off, turn that back on, then it just lifts the eye. If I'd used exposure on that, if I pick the eye layer, if I'd used exposure on the eye layer, I'd have to be much more careful with my mask because I was really sloppy with the mask, so I can't use exposure because you can see all of that. But as I use shadow recovery, it's only going to affect the shadows, not the highlights. So it's much more natural. Okay, where were we? Sometimes don't use local adjustments. Like in this particular image, let's say you think, oh, I really want to make that blue sky darker. You could spend hours and hours and hours trying to make a mask or doing an auto mask when really all you need is the color editor. So don't forget about the color editor. So we could simply choose our color editor, take our color editor picker, pick on our blue sky, click over here, and then simply drop lightness down, and hey presto, you've got a darker blue sky without having to do any adjustment whatsoever. Equally, if you wanted to change the red flag, we could then have another pick on the red flag and then drop the lightness either way on that without having to do any masking. So sometimes it doesn't make sense to use a local adjustment. Think about the color editor as well. Now, the most powerful combination is to use the color editor in combination with a local adjustment. And this is a good example of how to do that. Anthony's asking, can you use a click shift to draw a straight line? No, you can't, but again, that's actually a really good suggestion. If you don't know, in Photoshop, for example, you can make a mask at one point, say up here. You could, helps if we can see it, you could make a mask at one point here. You could hold shift down and click once and it would draw a straight line. And now I think that would be a really good addition to Capture One, so I shall feed that back. Alan's asking if I could run through heal layers and clone layers. If there's time I can. There was a previous webinar on that. You will get the archive link which has that in there as well, which is a whole 45 minutes on heal and clone. Okay, so let's show you an example on this particular excuse me while I die, sorry. I'll show you an example here where color editor and local adjustments really makes a good combo. So on this particular image, nice autumn day shot, for example, what I wanted to do was go to the color editor, take the picker, pick one of the nice autumn leaves and just give them a bit of help in terms of their brightness and saturation. But unfortunately, with only a little adjustment of the saturation slider, the old orange jumper here is really taking a beating from it. So this way, a combination of local adjustment and color editor makes a lot more sense. So in our local adjustments tool tab, what we can do here is a really rough mask and a color edit adjustment. And I say rough mask because remember, we pretty much want to say don't adjust the orange jumper here, for example. Don't adjust the sweatshirt. So the easiest way to do that is not to mask everything else, but is to mask the jumper and then invert it. You'll see what I mean in a minute. So if I just say plus, I call this sweater. Sorry, jumper's a very English word for what he's wearing. So let's take our brush, check I'm on full opacity. Let's go a bit bigger. And then I'm just going to do a really rough mask like this. Really not paying much attention. Don't have to be super accurate. I'm going to cover the face just in case because there's probably a bit of red tone in the skin, like that. And then I'm going to say invert mask, like so. So I'm only going to affect the stuff that's in the mask itself. Just going to take my erase brush actually. I don't think there's any red in the hands, but just in case, let's include those as well. So now we're only going to affect the leafy background pretty much. So now I can go to the color editor within the local adjustments tool tab over here, take the picker, pick on a leaf. Let's try this one. And now if I bump up saturation or say lightness, you see if I just go all the way with the leaves, all the way down again, you see I'm only affecting those so I can make them a bit brighter, bit more saturation without messing up the sweater as such. And to finish this one off, I think what I would probably do is just drop exposure a touch, bit more high dynamic range. This is all on the background layer, just for the skin tone. C for crop on the keyboard. Whoops, no square. Let's say unconstrained. C for crop on the keyboard, and let's say a bit of vignetting like so. And if we turn this layer on and off, then you can see dark leaves, brighter, more saturated leaves, like so. So again, just remember that mask is really rough. There's my mask. Wasn't created with any style finesse whatsoever, but it does the job. Of course, if we wanted to improve it a bit, like if I was being pernickety, we could zoom in and we could say, well, this leaf is missing out here. So I could just add those bits in if I wanted to, but you're never going to notice otherwise, to be honest. Brian is saying in 7, HDR could not be used on layers. That's correct. So in version 7, just to clarify, in version 7, you could only have exposure, sharpening, clarity, moire, and the color editor. That's it. So now in version 8, you've got white balance, which is what we're going to come to next. Great for interior photographers. Exposure, high dynamic range, sharpening, clarity, noise reduction, moire removal, color editor. Oh, and this one, purple fringing. I haven't personally found a use for this yet, but you might do. Purple fringing is basically used to be part of lens corrections, and it was just a checkbox. So remove purple fringing on or off. Sometimes you would see some purple haloing / fringing on high contrast subjects. Now there's a slider to remove it, and you can also have it as a local adjustment, because sometimes you might see that you've got purple fringing on one part of an image but not on the other. So it makes sense to have it as a local adjustment as such. Okay, local white balance. Let's see. Now on this particular image, we've got a classic issue. We've got artificial light on the ceiling here at a certain temperature, and then we've got daylight streaming in from the left at a different temperature. So what do? You can either, of course, white balance for the room inside, or we could white balance for the daylight out here. Neither of which is perfect, or do you go somewhere sort of in between as such? What we can do with version 8 is very simple. What the photographer's done here is he has a gradient mask I just press M. So it's got a gradient mask just drawn here. Roughly judge where the light is blending. And then all we can do on the local white balance, so on the background we can balance here. So let's just do a white balance probably off the bricks or here, for example. And then on our local white balance, up here, we could simply say, well, let's balance on the window frame here. And then we get a really nice, even local white balance across the whole image. So that's a really simple way that local white balance can help. It's great for mixed light sources in this situation here. Or you could just be creative with it if you wanted to, by having different white balances over the image. But I think this situation works nicely for everything. Okay, Christopher is asking, Capture One with Photoshop. Can you go back and forth with adjustments? Yes, so it's all non-destructive. So back and forth, back and forth. We're working on the raw data, remember, so we can do infinite number of changes, adjustments, and so on. We're basically looking at the raw data, looking at the currently applied adjustments, and then creating the preview on screen of what those adjustments are doing. So we never ever touch or alter the raw data. Of course, when you hit the export or process button, we're going to calculate the raw file plus adjustments to give you a TIFF file, which of course you can then take into Photoshop and do further things with. But all the time in Capture One, it is completely non-destructive. So that's local white balance, handy use for that. Auto mask, a couple of you have asked. I personally don't use it a great deal because I really don't find much of a use for it. But in this situation, it could be useful. I mean, if we wanted to, say, change the exposure of the sky, if we just drop the exposure down, you can see there is actually quite a lot of stuff going on there. But if we want the exposure right on the castle, then we need to do something close to that. So to mask around the sky would be very difficult manually, and there's not enough time in the world to do those kinds of things. So here we can actually use quite nicely an auto mask. Right click. You can see a checkbox here called auto mask. Turn that on. You'll see now the brush has 3 circles. The smaller center circle is the sample point. So this is what we're reading. So basically, I'm going to change options here and say only display mask when drawing. Let's just zoom in a bit. So if I start drawing masking here, like so, so I'm sampling the sky. Now as I get over to the castle, when I let go of the mouse or pen, it'll compare the sample point to the edge of the brush and then calculate the mask. So if I would just want to draw down the edge here and then let go, then it finds the edge quite nicely like that. In this case, I could just make the brush pretty enormous, and then we could just do that, and then you see it just finds the edge quite nicely. So it's pretty easy to do an auto mask like that, and then you could just work your way around the edge of the building like so. So nothing more complicated than that, basically. Just keep the center point in the sample zone, basically, and then watch where the edge of the brush is going, like so. You might prefer to be honest, you could probably just use complete full hardness brush. Probably doesn't make sense to have a feather. There we go. And then you can just mask happily around. Hope that makes sense. But then you see if I zoom out and we just drop exposure down, for example, you can see where I've masked, and then that way we can get our sky back around a complicated edge like so. Ilias is asking, is it possible to use a local adjustment to paint a color? No. So you've got to work with the image detail that you have there, basically. So you have to use what's in the image. You can't add something that isn't there in the image as such. David's asking about auto mask for Fuji X-Trans files. No, you're right. It's not currently available on Fuji X-Trans files. The auto mask is calculated by looking at the Bayer mosaic pattern, which of course isn't present on Fuji X-Trans cameras. So that's why it's not working currently, but is definitely something that we can look at in the future. Christopher's asking, how well does this work with flying hair? Good question. That's something I should try. I don't know. Imagine flying hair on a white background. It should separate it pretty easily, but it depends how well you can use the brush to sample the background and the hair in combination. Can you invert a mask? Yes, Simon, you can. Just right up here in Invert Mask, like so. So if I invert the mask, that would give us something very strange, but it is possible to invert the mask. Let's just have a little talk about Wacom and how I have it set up, which is nothing particularly complicated. In this example, let's just turn auto mask off for a second and get a slight feather. In this example, if we wanted to, mask around the S as such, I would personally find this very difficult to do with a mouse because it's really hard, I think, to do a fluid action with a mouse, whereas with a pen, it's much easier to do. I can follow the line of that curve pretty accurately, and I'm no pen expert either. I use a Wacom for everyday stuff as well, not just in Capture One. I find it much more comfortable than a mouse and quicker to use. It will probably drive you crazy for a day, and then you'll wonder how you ever live without it. That was my experience anyway, as such. Saying that wasn't a very good a good example there. But then E on the keyboard to change to arrays, and then you can just take that away, for example. The way I set the Wacom up, I don't do anything really that special. If we look in, System Preferences under Wacom, I've got particular settings for Capture One. The only thing I have on the front click button is set to pan and scroll, which just means that I can scroll thumbnails like so by click and holding. The top button is set to double click, which means if I'm on the hand tool, H on the keyboard, if I click it once, I can zoom in and I can zoom back out to 100%. So that's nothing particularly spectacular, but it can save a bit of time. In terms of the touch ring, so on the left-hand side of the Wacom, it looks like this. You've got some shortcut buttons, which I don't really use. And you've got this touch-sensitive jog ring, if you like. The only thing I use that for is to change brush sizes. So if I'm in the brush and I activate the touch ring, I can make the brush bigger without having to go into the dialog, and I can make the brush harder or softer, again without having to enter the dialog. The other thing that can be handy if you really want to be able to mask around tricky sections, so if I just drop size and hardness a bit, there's something called precision mode, which if I turn on, it remaps the entire graphics tablet to a small part on the screen. So say if you wanted to really carefully go around a particular spot, then you can do so. So it makes your tablet super sluggish basically, but very, very accurate if you need to do really, really tricky masking. It's something I use rarely, but it can be quite handy if you need to really get into a tight spot. If you want to know a bit more about that, if you look on our blog, Capture One, blog.phase1.com, just type in Wacom in the search engine, and then you'll see a little guide to shortcuts to a Wacom tablet, which talks about the various different adjustments like so. I did experiment with this called the Radial Menu, which I haven't set up yet again since getting this improved laptop, but the Radial Menu lets you save various shortcuts. So what you can do on the pen itself, if you set this to the Radial Menu, just by a little click, it pops up a menu which you can have various shortcuts on, like export, for example, or copy adjustments, undo, all kinds of things. So that's something which I might revisit at a later date, but as I haven't missed having it, maybe I didn't use it that much. So there we go. I'm using an Intuos 5 Touch. Someone was asking. It's not available anymore. It's now called an Intuos Pro, but pretty much does the same thing. And as I said, if you're serious about doing local adjustments, I think it's definitely the way forward. They're not super expensive. I don't know how the frame rate is on the transmission, but I can pretty much draw this almost perfectly without any mistakes, like so. And as I said, I'm no illustrator or pen expert, but it doesn't take long to get up to speed with using a tablet. So then in this case, if I wanted to ignore my little mistake there, but if I wanted to, bump up the exposure, then I can pretty much have penned that in quite accurately. And as I say, trying to do that on a mouse would be definitely painful. Whoops, too much, like so. Russell says drawing with a mouse is very similar to drawing with a brick. Exactly. I find it extremely difficult to draw nicely with a mouse, and it hurts my wrist pretty much. So I've found after working a long time ago as a retoucher that using a mouse for a day would be absolutely killer, and using a pen is much more comfortable. Rosemary's asking, are there any differences between version 7 and version 8 using a Wacom tablet? No, nothing at all. It's all exactly the same. The only thing I would say is that with the Wacom, just make sure your Wacom driver is up to date. It's a little bit flaky sometimes, I find. So I would just make sure the driver's always up to date and just keep on top of that. Pat was asking about mapping. I've got 2 monitors, which just helps with the webinars. So I map the tablet across both monitors, which does mean that kind of half the tablet is on monitor 1 and the other half is on monitor 2. But to be honest, I don't really seem to notice it, and I think that works really nicely. And you can move much faster from point to point. So if I want to click on a thumbnail and then go straight away up to a tool tab and then go up here and then go over here, for example, it's much faster doing that as a mouse, and you don't have that annoying clicking sound, which is a really OCD thing to say, but it's quieter using a pen. Okay, I think that nearly brings us to the end of our session. I was just looking at the last few images to see if there was anything interesting to comment. Again, this is just, if we see the original image, how dull the original image is on the right hand side, with not much work on a few local adjustments, which is simply darken the sky with a gradation, darken the foreground a very tiny bit. You can probably barely see that. Then I just had some dodging and burning, again a really tiny amount, which I would probably improve on. For example, if I drop my opacity right down, probably have a larger brush, I think then I was just kind of trying to brush in a little bit of drama on the clouds, etc., which is really easy to do. And on the sky gradation, it's affecting the monument a bit too much. So, oops, I want erase. E on the keyboard for erase. Low opacity. So again, we could just take away some of the sky grad on the top of the rocks, like so. Rocks isn't the right word. That's a bit of an insult. Pat hasn't heard of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. There you go. So not saying that I've got it, but maybe a little bit with respect to some things. So before you have to go, I just want to make you aware of next week's webinar. That's going to be with a great guy called, sorry, I'm just getting up the information for you. A great guy called Camille Tamiola. He's a landscape, automotive, multidisciplined photographer based in Italy. Really interesting guy to talk about. He has a background in engineering and science, so he does a lot of work in improving noise reduction and long exposure photography and so on. He's done some talks for TED, the TED organization, and he's a really interesting guy to listen to. So if you can tune into that one next week, I'd thoroughly recommend it. I'll paste the sign up link into the chat window right now. Hopefully that will come through to you right now. I'll also include it in the follow-up email, which you're going to get shortly too. Expanding on that, if you want to watch the recording, when you get your follow-up email, there'll be a link in there to the archive of all the webinars so far. I've just set that up on YouTube, so it will have this one and previous ones as well for those of you who've attended. There'll also be a link to a questionnaire. It'd be very useful if you could fill that in. It's always a help to know what you think. And of course, it would be fantastic to see you back on future webinars as well. If I didn't get to some questions, feel free to hang on for a little bit. I'll look at the last few questions that have come in that I didn't perhaps get to. Sorry if I didn't get to yours. There was rather a lot of you, so it's pretty difficult to get to every single thing. But I hope it was useful. Many thanks for your attendance, and I hope to see you all again shortly. Thank you.